In 1999, there was not a shopping mall in Canada without a Jacob store. Not one. From St. John's, Newfoundland, to Victoria, British Columbia, every major mall, every high street that mattered had that name on the window. Jacob, clean letters, warm light inside, the kind of store a woman walked past and thought, that's where I shop. At its peak, Jacob operated more than 250 locations across this country. 4,000 Canadians went to work there every morning. For an entire generation of women, Jacob was where you bought your first real blazer, your first job interview outfit, the dress you wore to your best friend's wedding. Then H&M arrived, then Zara. Then the internet changed everything about how people shop, and Jacob refused to change with it. By October 2014, every single store was gone. 92 locations liquidated in a matter of weeks. The lights went out, the doors locked, and 37 years of Canadian fashion history ended not with a fight, but with a clearance sale. How does a brand that knew its customer better than almost anyone lose her completely? This is the story of Jacob, and it is a story that belongs to every Canadian woman who ever walked through those doors. The story of Jacob does not begin with a business plan. It begins with a family, a small industrial town, and a man who believed that Canadian women deserved better than what they were being offered. Sorel, Quebec in the 1960s was not the kind of place people associated with fashion. It sat on the south shore of the St. Lawrence River, about an hour northeast of Montreal. A working town built on steel manufacturing and shipbuilding. The women who lived there were practical, proud, and largely ignored by the fashion industry. The stores available to them were either too expensive to be realistic or too cheap to be worth wearing. Jacob Basmaji, the father, understood this gap. He opened a small apparel shop in Sorel sometime in the early 1960s, selling clothing to the women of his community. Nothing glamorous, nothing revolutionary, just good merchandise at a price that made sense for the people around him. It was a modest operation, the kind of family business that exists in every small Canadian town, and that most people never think twice about. His son Joey thought about it constantly. Joey Basmaji grew up watching his father serve those women. He learned the rhythm of retail before he learned anything else. How a customer moves through a store, what makes her stop, what makes her reach out and touch a fabric, what makes her come back. When Joey took over the family business in 1977, he was not simply inheriting a shop. He was inheriting a philosophy. Know your customer, respect your customer, and never give her a reason to go somewhere else. But Joey had a vision that went beyond Sorel. He looked at the Canadian women's fashion market in the late 1970s and saw a specific gap that nobody was filling well. On one end sat the expensive department stores, Holt Renfrew, the better floors of Eaton's. Beautiful merchandise that most working women could not regularly afford. On the other end sat the discount racks, affordable but generic, the kind of clothing that felt like a compromise rather than a choice. In the middle, largely unserved, was the woman Joey had been watching his entire life. She was educated. She was entering the workforce in numbers that would reshape Canadian society. She cared about how she looked. She had a budget that was real, not unlimited. And she wanted to feel, when she walked out of a store with a shopping bag, that she had chosen something, not just settled for something. Joey renamed the business Boutique Jacob after his father, and he set about building the store that woman deserved. The original Boutique Jacob on the main street of Sorel was small by any standard, but it was deliberate in a way that set it apart from everything around it. The merchandise was organized cleanly. The lighting was warm and direct. The kind of light that showed a garment honestly rather than hiding its flaws in shadow. The racks were not overcrowded. There was room to browse, room to think, room to hold something up and actually see it. The collection Joey built for that first store reflected a dual understanding of his customer's life. She needed clothes for the office, blazers, tailored trousers, blouses that projected competence without sacrificing femininity. She also needed clothes for the evening, for the weekend, for the occasions when she wanted to feel something more than professional. Jacob carried both, at prices that did not force a choice between looking good and paying rent. The early customers were the women of Sorel in the surrounding region. secretaries, nurses, teachers, young mothers returning to work. They came in because the store was there. They came back because Joey had gotten something right about what they needed. Word moved the way it always moves in a small town. Through conversation, through a friend noticing what another friend was wearing, through the simple and powerful act of one woman telling another, "You should go to Jacob." Joey had one phrase he returned to again and again when describing his customer. He never called her a demographic. He never called her a market segment. He called her she. She wants to browse. She wants to discover. She wants to experience, not just transact. That belief shaped everything about how Jacob was built. The store experience was never designed around speed or volume. It was designed around the pleasure of being in the space, of finding something, of leaving with the feeling that you had been understood by the place you just shopped in. For the women of Sorel in 1977, that feeling was new, and it was enough to build something much larger than a boutique on the St. Lawrence River. By the time Joey began thinking about expansion, he already knew one thing with certainty. The woman he was serving in Sorel was not unique to Sorel. She lived in Toronto, she lived in Halifax, she lived in Calgary and Vancouver, and every mid-sized Canadian city in between. She was waiting, and Jacob was coming. The first store outside Quebec opened in Toronto in 1985. It was not a tentative move, it was a declaration. Joey Basmaji was not testing a new market. He was telling the rest of Canada that Jacob had arrived and that it intended to stay. Toronto in the mid-1980s was a city in the middle of transforming itself. The financial district was expanding. Women were entering professional life in numbers that had no precedent in Canadian history. The power suit was not a fashion statement. It was a uniform of ambition, a signal that a woman had claimed her seat at the table and intended to keep it. Department stores offered options, but they were expensive and impersonal. The mass market offered price but not style. Jacob offered both, and Toronto noticed immediately. The Eaton Centre location, one of the early Toronto stores, sat inside one of the busiest shopping destinations in the country. The foot traffic alone was enormous, but Jacob did not simply benefit from location. Women came in because a friend had told them to. They came back because Joey's original philosophy held. The experience was different. The staff knew the product. The lighting was right. The clothing made sense for an actual life. Not a runway, not a fantasy, but the real daily life of a Canadian woman who needed to look pulled together on a Tuesday morning and still feel like herself on a Friday night. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Jacob spread across Ontario, then east into the Maritimes, then west across the prairies and into British Columbia. Each new province was not simply a new territory. It was a confirmation that the woman Joey had been designing for in Sorel existed everywhere in this country, and that she had been waiting for exactly this. The 1990s were Jacob's decade. If there is a single era that lives in the memory of the women who loved this brand, it is those years, in 1990 to 2002, roughly, when Jacob was not merely popular but essential, when the store was a destination, not just a stop, when walking through those doors on a Saturday afternoon felt like something worth doing for its own sake. Picture a specific Saturday, a woman in her late 20s, perhaps in Winnipeg, perhaps in Hamilton, perhaps in Halifax. It does not matter which city because the experience was consistent across all of them. She walks into Jacob mid-morning. The store smells faintly of new fabric and something clean, something that is hard to name, but immediately recognizable as belonging to that specific place. Soft music plays in the background. Not too loud, never intrusive. The racks are organized by color and category, not crammed together in a way that makes browsing feel like work. She is looking for something to wear to a colleague's birthday dinner. She is not certain what. She pulls a deep burgundy wrap dress off a rack, a style that Jacob did exceptionally well throughout the 1990s. That particular combination of elegant and practical that required real understanding of how women's bodies actually moved. She holds it up. A staff member, not hovering but present, offers a quiet observation about fit. The woman tries it on. The mirror in the fitting room is honest. The light is good. She buys the dress. She wears it for years. That transaction, unremarkable on paper, completely ordinary in its details, is the transaction that Jacob built an empire on. Not the flashy purchase, not the special occasion splurge, but the reliable, repeatable experience of finding exactly what you needed in a place that felt like it had been designed specifically for you. Jacob's sub-brands emerged during this period as extensions of that same philosophy, each one targeting a specific aspect of its customer's life, with the same careful attention Joey had applied from the beginning. Jacob Connection launched to serve petite women, a segment that mainstream retail had long treated as an afterthought, offering scaled-down versions of regular clothing that rarely fit correctly. Jacob Connection was built from the ground up for smaller frames, with proportions and cuts designed specifically for the petite body rather than simply reduced from standard sizing. For women who had spent years settling for clothing that almost fit, it was a revelation. Jacob Lingerie followed, extending the brand's understanding of its customer from the boardroom into the most personal corners of her wardrobe. Jacob Jr. brought younger women and teenage girls into the family, daughters who had grown up watching their mothers shop at Jacob and were now ready to walk through the doors themselves. The intergenerational dimension of Jacob's customer base was not accidental. It was cultivated carefully over 2 decades. By the mid-1990s, Jacob was not just a store, it was a relationship. A grandmother had shopped there. She had taken her daughter. The daughter was now taking her own daughter. 3 generations of Canadian women standing in the same fitting rooms, holding up the same styles of clothing, having versions of the same conversations about what fit and what didn't, and what they were going to wear to whatever was coming next in their lives. The employees who worked at Jacob during these years described something that is difficult to quantify but impossible to miss in their accounts: a sense of genuine pride in where they worked. This was not a fast food job to get through. For many women, a position at Jacob was a real career entry point into fashion retail, into visual merchandising, into management. The training was substantive. The culture at the store level reflected Joey's foundational belief that the customer deserved to be understood. And that meant the people serving her needed to actually understand clothing, not just process transactions. A floor associate in a Jacob store in the 1990s was expected to know the collection thoroughly. She was expected to be able to dress a customer for multiple occasions: the office, the evening, the weekend, not just sell her what she had already decided to buy. That expectation created a different kind of retail environment, one where the staff felt invested in the outcome of every visit in a way that most chain retail did not produce. For many of those employees, Jacob was not simply a paycheck. It was the place where they learned their profession, where they understood for the first time what good retail actually felt like from the inside. By the late 1990s, Jacob had more than 100 locations operating across Canada. The company was profitable, growing, and regarded within the Canadian fashion industry as one of the genuine success stories of domestic retail. Joey Basmaji had taken his father's small-town shop and built something that belonged, in a meaningful way, to the national identity of Canadian women. What was it about that store that made a woman feel, every time she walked in, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be? The answer was simpler than anyone in a boardroom would have admitted. Jacob felt like it had been built by someone who actually knew her. In an industry that constantly told women what they should want, Jacob had spent 20 years asking what they actually needed, and then providing it consistently at a price that did not require an apology. That was the golden era. That was what was worth losing. And in a few years, the first signs that it could all disappear would begin to appear, quietly, almost invisibly, in the decisions being made far from the shop floors where those women still browsed, still discovered, still experienced exactly what Joey had always promised them they would. In the year 2000, Joey Basmaji made a decision that made complete sense at the time and would look very different in hindsight. He pushed the accelerator. Jacob had spent the 1980s proving it could work outside Quebec. It had spent the 1990s proving it could work across an entire country. Now, with more than 100 locations operating profitably and a brand that Canadian women genuinely loved, Joey did what every successful retailer in North America was doing at the turn of the millennium. He expanded aggressively, opened more stores, launched more sub-brands, and bet heavily on the idea that growth was the natural continuation of success. It was not an unreasonable bet. The Canadian retail environment in the early 2000s still rewarded physical presence. The internet existed, but e-commerce was not yet a serious factor in clothing retail. The shopping mall was still the center of Canadian consumer life. If you wanted to reach Canadian women, you planted your flag in as many malls as possible and made sure your store looked better than the one next to it. Jacob followed that logic to its conclusion. By the mid-2000s, the company had grown to more than 250 locations operating under multiple banners. Jacob, Jacob Connection, Jacob Lingerie, Jacob Jr., Jacob Outlet, and Joseph, a premium line positioned slightly above the core brand. The footprint stretched from Newfoundland to British Columbia, from flagship locations in the Eaton Centre and Rideau Centre to mid-sized malls in cities that most fashion retailers ignored entirely. On paper, it looked like an empire. In practice, it was the beginning of a problem that would take years to fully reveal itself. The structural issue with Jacob's expansion was not visible in the store count. It was visible in the cost structure underneath it. Unlike American chain retailers who built their growth through franchising, sharing both the upside and the risk with individual franchise owners, Jacob operated every single one of its locations as a company-owned store. Every lease was signed by Boutique Jacob Inc. Every employee was on the company payroll. Every fit-out, every renovation, every piece of signage, every rack and fixture and lighting installation was a direct corporate expense. This model had real advantages. It meant that the experience a customer had in a Jacob store in Moncton was essentially the same experience she had in a Jacob store in Calgary. The quality of the merchandise was consistent. The staff training was consistent. The visual presentation of the store was consistent. Joey's original philosophy, that she deserved a specific kind of experience, could be maintained across 250 locations in a way that a franchise model would have made much harder to control. But it also meant that every single one of those 250 locations represented a fixed cost that did not adjust when sales declined. The mall leases Jacob signed in the early 2000s were long-term commitments, 5 years, 10 years, negotiated at rental rates that reflected the optimism of that moment in Canadian retail. Those leases did not care what happened to consumer spending in 2008. They did not care about H&M. They did not renegotiate themselves when the environment changed. They simply had to be paid. The sub-brand strategy compounded the problem in ways that were not immediately obvious. On the surface, Jacob Connection, Jacob Lingerie, Jacob Jr., Jacob Outlet, and Joseph each made logical sense. They extended the brand's reach into adjacent markets. They gave different segments of Jacob's customer base a more tailored experience. They signaled that Jacob was not standing still, that it was evolving, diversifying, growing in sophistication alongside its customers. But each sub-brand required its own inventory, its own buying team, its own merchandising strategy, its own store design. The operational complexity of running 6 distinct retail concepts under one corporate structure was enormous. The management bandwidth required to maintain quality and consistency across all of them simultaneously was something that had worked when the company was smaller and more focused. At 250-plus locations spanning 6 banners, it stretched the organization in ways that began to show in subtle but real ways, in the occasional inconsistency of a store that was not quite up to standard, in buying decisions that missed the mark, in the gradual blurring of what each banner actually stood for. Jacob's greatest strength, its clear, specific understanding of who she was, began to diffuse as the company tried to be too many things to too many slightly different versions of that customer at the same time. For the employees living through the expansion years, the experience was a mixture of genuine excitement and growing unease. New stores meant new jobs, new management opportunities, new cities. For a woman who had started on the floor of a Jacob store in Mississauga in 1992 and worked her way into district management, the early 2000s felt like the company was finally operating at the scale it had always been capable of. Promotions were available. The brand was visible everywhere. Being part of Jacob felt still like being part of something that mattered. But the targets were getting harder. The pressure from head office was increasing. In the mid-1990s, a store manager had real latitude to know her customer, to make decisions about what to emphasize on the floor, to manage her team with the kind of personal attention that Joey had always believed in. By 2004 and 2005, the metrics were becoming more rigid, the reporting more demanding, the distance between the floor and the decisions being made in Montreal more pronounced. The company was, in the way that all growing companies eventually do, becoming more corporate. The warmth that had defined Jacob at the store level was not gone, but it was being diluted slowly by the machinery required to operate at national scale. And then quietly in 2004, two things happened that would change everything. H&M opened its first Canadian store in Toronto, and Zara arrived the same year. Neither event registered as a crisis at Jacob's head office in Montreal. Why would it? Jacob had faced competition before. The Canadian women's fashion market was not new territory. There were already dozens of players, and Jacob had outlasted and outperformed most of them. Two new foreign entrants, even well-capitalized ones, did not seem like an existential threat to a brand with 250 locations, a loyal customer base, and 30 years of earned trust. That calculation would turn out to be one of the most consequential errors in the history of Canadian retail. The peak was real. The 250 stores were real. The 4,000 employees and the 3 generations of loyal customers and the 30 years of genuine connection with Canadian women, all of it was real. But underneath the numbers, the foundation was already carrying more weight than it had been built to hold. And the weight was about to get heavier. There is a specific kind of institutional trust that takes decades to build and cannot be manufactured or purchased or replicated by a competitor with a larger marketing budget. It is the trust that comes from being present, consistently and reliably, at the moments in a person's life that actually matter. Not the headline moments, not the weddings and the graduations, though Jacob was there for those too, but the quiet, ordinary, accumulating moments that together make up the texture of a life. Jacob had that trust. By the mid-2000s, it had been earning it for nearly 30 years. At its peak, Jacob operated 250 stores across 10 provinces. 4,000 Canadians held Jacob on their employment records. The brand existed in every major Canadian city and in dozens of smaller ones, in the kinds of mid-sized communities that larger fashion retailers routinely overlooked, where Jacob was not one option among many, but often the only option of its kind within reasonable distance. That geographic reach mattered in a way that pure location counts do not capture. Jacob was not clustered in the urban center where fashion retail was already crowded. It was distributed across the country in a pattern that mirrored the actual distribution of Canadian women's lives. In Lethbridge and Thunder Bay and Fredericton, as much as in Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal. For women in those communities, Jacob was not a convenience. It was the store. The generational dimension of Jacob's customer base was, by the 2000s, something that no competitor could claim and no amount of advertising spending could quickly replicate. A woman who had bought her first Jacob blazer in 1988 was now in her 40s. She had been shopping there for 15 years. She knew the brand the way you know a place you have returned to so many times that you no longer have to think about navigating it. You simply belong there. She had brought her teenage daughter into the store for the first time a few years earlier, had watched her daughter pull things off racks with the same instinctive confidence that she herself had developed over years of visits. That daughter was now old enough to shop independently, and she shopped at Jacob because her mother had taken her there, because the brand was woven into her understanding of what getting dressed well looked like, because some combination of memory and familiarity and genuine quality had made Jacob the default answer to the question of where to go when you needed something real to wear. 3 generations of Canadian women in many families. Grandmother, mother, daughter, each with her own Jacob story, her own version of the fitting room conversation, her own memory of carrying that distinctive shopping bag out of a mall and feeling, in the uncomplicated way that good retail produces, genuinely satisfied. That kind of loyalty is not a marketing metric. It is a social fact. It existed in living rooms and office break rooms and school hallways across the country. in conversations that Jacob's head office in Montreal could not have scripted and did not need to, because the customers were doing the work themselves, passing the brand from one generation to the next the way families pass down anything they have found to be reliably good. Joey Basmaji understood this better than almost anyone. He had built the company around a specific, deeply held belief about what his customer deserved, and that belief had been vindicated over 30 years by the behavior of the women who kept coming back. When he spoke about Jacob's customer, always she, always with that quality of attention that suggested a real person rather than an abstraction. He was not performing the language of customer centricity. He meant it in the way that founders who have built something by hand and maintained it through difficulty always mean it when they describe what they were trying to do. Jacob had also, by the mid-2000s, attempted to extend its reach beyond Canada's borders. A store had opened in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a genuine attempt to test whether the brand could travel south and find the same kind of customer in the American market. The American woman Joey was designing for existed in New England the same way she existed in Ontario. Educated, professional, practical about budget, unwilling to compromise entirely on style. The Cambridge store was not a vanity project. It was a real bet on the idea that Jacob had built something transferable. The American expansion did not take hold at scale. The competitive environment south of the border was considerably more crowded, and Jacob did not have the capital to build American presence at the pace that would have been required to establish the brand. But the attempt itself said something important about where Joey believed Jacob stood in the mid-2000s. He was not managing a regional chain toward a comfortable plateau. He was still building. Inside the stores during this period, the culture that Joey had established in Sorel in 1977 was still recognizable, still operating, still producing the experience that had made Jacob what it was. A customer who walked into a well-run Jacob store in 2005 encountered something that the fast fashion chains arriving from Europe could not yet match. Not speed, not price, but knowledge. The staff knew the collection. They knew what worked together and what didn't. They knew the difference between what a customer said she was looking for and what she actually needed. And they had been trained to bridge that gap with the kind of quiet, confident guidance that made a woman feel served rather than sold to. That quality of service was Joey's original promise, maintained across 250 locations through sheer organizational commitment to a standard that most retailers found too expensive to sustain. It was the thing that made Jacob feel, even at national scale, like a boutique, like a place where someone had thought carefully about what you would need before you arrived. What had been built by the middle of the first decade of the 21st century was something genuinely rare in Canadian commercial life. A homegrown fashion brand with national reach, generational loyalty, and a clear, coherent identity that had survived 30 years of market shifts without losing its essential character. A brand that 4,000 people were proud to work for, that millions of women trusted without needing to think about it, that had earned its place in the fabric of Canadian daily life, not through advertising or celebrity endorsement, but through the accumulated weight of 30 years of keeping its promise. When a brand earns that kind of trust, when it becomes, in the quiet and unspectacular way that Jacob had, a piece of how people understand their own lives, what exactly does it take to destroy it? The answer was already in motion, and it had nothing to do with the women who loved Jacob, or the employees who served them, or even the competitors who were beginning to take their share of the market. It had to do with a single decision, made and unmade and made again in a boardroom in Montreal, about whether Jacob would step into the future or wait for the future to come to it. In September 2004, H&M opened its first Canadian store at Yorkdale Shopping Centre in Toronto. The lineup outside stretched around the building before the doors opened. Shoppers had been waiting for hours. Some had been waiting for years. They had crossed the border into the United States specifically to shop at H&M, had carried the bags home on the highway, had told their friends about the prices and the styles and the sheer volume of what was available for what it cost. Now it was here, in Canada, in the same malls where Jacob had been operating for 20 years. H&M's entry price points were 30 to 40% below Jacob's on comparable items. A blazer that Jacob sold for $120 H&M offered for 75. A dress that Jacob priced at 90, H&M had for 55. The quality was not the same. Anyone who examined the fabric side by side understood that immediately. But quality comparisons require time and attention. And the initial reaction of a woman standing in front of two blazers with a $45 gap between them is not always a careful assessment of thread count. Zara arrived the same year. Where H&M competed on price, Zara competed on speed. Its inventory turned over every 2 weeks. New styles arrived on the floor before customers had finished thinking about the ones from the previous visit. The experience of shopping at Zara produced a specific kind of urgency. If you see something you want, buy it now, because it will not be there next week. Jacob's buying cycle operated on traditional seasonal rhythms, 4 collections per year, each one carefully considered and deliberately curated. Against Zara's relentless churn, that deliberateness began to look to a certain kind of customer like slowness. Jacob's head office in Montreal registered these arrivals. The competitive intelligence was there. The sales data from stores near new H&M and Zara locations showed the impact clearly enough. But the response was measured, almost calm. An organizational confidence that the loyalty Jacob had built over 30 years would hold against competitors who had no history in this country and no relationship with the women who had been shopping at Jacob since before H&M existed as a concept in Canada. That confidence was not entirely wrong. Jacob's core customer, the woman in her 30s and 40s who had been coming back for 15 years, did not immediately defect. She had too much invested in the relationship, too much genuine affection for the brand, to walk away over a price difference on a single item. She kept coming back, but she was starting to make different calculations at the margin. The impulse purchase that she once made automatically at Jacob, she now sometimes made at H&M. The younger woman she might have brought into Jacob for the first time was discovering Zara instead. The damage was not dramatic, it was incremental. And incremental damage in a company carrying the fixed cost structure that Jacob had built through its aggressive expansion is precisely the kind of damage that does not announce itself until it has already become serious. The e-commerce question surfaced during this same period, and the way Jacob handled it would later be understood as the single most consequential decision in the company's history. In the mid-2000s, Joey Basmaji's team engaged a Montreal-based digital firm called CloudRaker to work on Jacob's digital platforms. The collaboration was genuine and productive, strategic work, creative work, the kind of partnership that a forward-looking company builds with people who understand where technology is going. CloudRaker pushed for e-commerce. The data they brought to those conversations was not speculative. They were working with eBay at the same time, and they knew with first-hand precision that Canadian consumers were ready to buy clothing online. The shift was not coming, it had already begun. Joey listened. Joey engaged with the argument seriously, and then Joey said no. His reasoning was not dismissive or ignorant. It came from the same deeply held philosophy that had built the company in the first place. She wants to browse. She wants to discover. She wants to experience, not just transact from behind a machine. He believed, genuinely and with 30 years of evidence behind the belief, that what Jacob offered was an in-store experience that could not and should not be reduced to a transaction on a screen. That the tactile reality of touching fabric, of standing in good light, of having a knowledgeable person nearby, these were not incidental features of shopping at Jacob. They were the product. He was not wrong about what Jacob offered. He was wrong about whether that would be enough. CloudRaker backed away from the e-commerce push. The relationship continued. The digital platforms were improved in other ways. But the store remained the store, and the website remained a brochure rather than a sales channel. In the window that existed in the mid-2000s, when building a genuine e-commerce operation was still achievable at manageable cost, when the infrastructure was not yet dominated by Amazon, when Canadian women were only beginning to shift their shopping behavior online, that window stayed open for a few more years and then quietly closed. The 2008 global financial crisis did not create Jacob's problems. It accelerated them past the point where they could be managed quietly. Consumer spending on discretionary clothing dropped sharply across Canada in late 2008 and through 2009. This was not a Jacob-specific phenomenon. Every apparel retailer in the country felt it simultaneously. But Jacob felt it with particular severity because of the cost structure underneath its 250-plus locations. When revenue drops 10% across a portfolio of company-owned stores with long-term mall leases and a full corporate payroll, the financial pressure is not theoretical. It is immediate, structural, and compounding. Jacob began closing stores in 2008. Not a handful. 52 locations shuttered between 2008 and 2009. 52 stores in roughly 12 months. Employees who had worked at those locations for years arrived one morning to find that their store was on the closure list. Some were offered transfers, many were not. The severance process for a company under this kind of financial stress was not generous. How long could a company this beloved actually hold on against forces it had chosen not to confront directly? The women who were still shopping at Jacob in 2009, and there were still many of them, still loyal, still coming back, largely did not know the full picture. They saw a store that looked a little emptier than it used to. They noticed that the Jacob Connection banner had disappeared from a nearby mall. They may have driven past a location that had closed and felt a brief, vague unease before moving on with their day. They did not yet understand that what they were witnessing was not a temporary adjustment. It was the beginning of the end. And the decisions that would determine whether Jacob survived or didn't were about to be made under the worst possible conditions, by a man who loved his company too much to see it clearly, at a moment when clarity was the only thing that could have saved it. In November 2010, Boutique Jacob Inc. filed for protection under the Companies Creditors Arrangement Act in the Quebec Superior Court. The numbers were stark. The company owed more than $29 million to suppliers who had shipped merchandise that had not been fully paid for, to employees whose wages had fallen behind, to the National Bank of Canada. The filing was not a surprise to anyone inside the company who had been watching the financials through 2009 and 2010. It was, in the way that these things always are when they finally become public, both a shock and an inevitability. The moment when what had been a private struggle became a matter of public record. For the women who had been shopping at Jacob for 20 years, the news landed differently. This was not an abstract corporate filing. This was the place where they had bought their first blazer, where they had taken their daughters, where they had spent 30 years of Saturday afternoons. The response on social media, still relatively young as a platform for public grief in 2010, but already powerful enough to carry this kind of news, was immediate and emotional. Women posted photographs of their favorite Jacob pieces. They wrote about specific purchases, specific stores, specific saleswomen who had helped them find something perfect for an occasion they still remembered. The outpouring was genuine, and it was large. And it told the story of what Jacob actually meant to the people who had loved it in a way that no financial document could. Joey Basmaji and his team used that response as evidence that restructuring was worth attempting. The customers were still there. The loyalty was still real. If the company could reduce its cost structure, renegotiate its leases, and emerge from creditor protection as a leaner operation, there was a brand worth saving on the other side of the process. That belief was not unreasonable. But the restructuring that followed would reveal, with painful clarity, the limits of what goodwill alone could accomplish against structural problems that had been building for a decade. The restructuring process that unfolded through 2011 produced a company that was smaller, less burdened by its worst leases, and theoretically better positioned to survive. Approximately 50 additional locations were closed or consolidated. The sub-brand portfolio was rationalized. The debt load was reduced to a level that made ongoing operations viable, at least on paper. Jacob emerged from creditor protection in late 2011 with roughly 92 stores still operating, a reduced workforce, and a management team that was exhausted from 2 years of crisis navigation, but genuinely committed to the idea that the core brand was strong enough to rebuild around. What the restructuring did not produce was a fundamental rethinking of the strategic decisions that had created the crisis in the first place. The e-commerce platform remained underdeveloped. Jacob's online presence in 2012 was not meaningfully different from what it had been in 2007. A website that displayed merchandise and provided store locations, but did not function as a real sales channel. The decision that Joey had made in the mid-2000s to prioritize the in-store experience over digital commerce had not been revisited in any serious way during the restructuring. The crisis had been treated as a financial problem. Too much debt, too many stores, too much fixed cost, rather than as a strategic problem rooted in a fundamental misreading of where retail was going. This distinction matters enormously. A financial problem can be solved by financial means, by closing stores, renegotiating leases, reducing headcount, restructuring debt. Jacob did all of those things. A strategic problem requires a different kind of solution, a willingness to question the core assumptions of the business, to rebuild around a new understanding of what the customer now needs and how she now shops. That kind of rethinking is harder, slower, more disruptive, and more expensive than financial restructuring. It requires a founder to look at the company he built and acknowledge that the beliefs that made it great may no longer be sufficient to keep it alive. Joey Basmaji could not fully make that acknowledgement, not because he was incapable of it. He was a man of genuine intelligence and deep commercial instinct, but because the belief that she wanted to experience rather than transact was not simply a business strategy. It was the founding philosophy of the entire enterprise. To abandon it felt from the inside like abandoning Jacob itself. The competitive environment that Jacob re-entered after its restructuring was not the same one it had left. Between 2010 and 2013, the Canadian retail market underwent a transformation that was faster and more complete than almost anyone in the domestic industry had anticipated. American chains that had long ignored Canada moved north in force. Target entered the Canadian market in 2013, acquiring the former Zellers locations and establishing an immediate national footprint. J.Crew arrived. Nordstrom announced its Canadian expansion. The market that had once been relatively protected by geography and the complexity of cross-border retail operations was now fully open, and the international players entering it were better capitalized, more digitally sophisticated, and more aggressive on price than any competition Jacob had faced in its first 30 years. Against this landscape, Jacob's 92 remaining stores were not a foundation for recovery. They were a diminishing asset in a market that was reorganizing itself around different rules. The women who had been loyal to Jacob for decades were still loyal, but loyalty by 2012 and 2013 required something in return. It required a store that felt current, that carried merchandise that reflected what was happening in fashion rather than lagging behind it, that offered a digital experience consistent with how those women were increasingly managing every other aspect of their lives. Jacob was providing some of that some of the time in some locations. It was not providing it consistently at scale in a way that gave a customer who had once chosen Jacob automatically a clear reason to keep choosing it over the alternatives that were now everywhere around her. The people who felt the consequences most directly were not the executives in Montreal. They were the employees on the floors of those 92 stores, women who had built real careers at Jacob, who had 15 and 20 years of institutional knowledge, who had survived the first restructuring and stayed because they believed in what they were doing and because Jacob, even diminished, was still the company they had chosen. Through 2012 and 2013, those employees lived with a specific and grinding uncertainty. The question of whether their store would still be open next month was never fully answered. Sales targets that had been achievable in 2005 were not achievable in 2013, not because the employees were performing differently, but because the traffic was not there in the same way, because the woman who used to come in every 6 weeks was now coming in every 4 months, because the impulse purchase that had once been automatic was now being made somewhere else or not made at all. The management communications from Montreal remained carefully optimistic throughout this period. There were plans, there were initiatives, there was always a next step being developed, a new strategy being considered, a reason to believe that the trajectory could be reversed. The people on the floor heard those communications and did what people in that position always do. They kept working, kept serving the customers who came in, kept maintaining the standards that Joey had established, and tried not to think too directly about what the foot traffic numbers were telling them. Who exactly was supposed to protect the people who had built this company? The women who had given Jacob 20 years of their professional lives, who had trained generations of younger staff, who had maintained Joey's original promise to the customer long after the financial foundations of the company had begun to give way. The answer, as it turned out, was no one. By early 2014, the reality that had been visible in the numbers for 2 years had become impossible to ignore at the executive level. The relaunch plan that Christelle Basmaji, Joey's daughter, who had become a spokeswoman for the company during the restructuring years, had described as viable was not producing results. The new financing that the company needed to sustain operations through another seasonal cycle had not materialized. The window for a genuine strategic transformation had not simply closed. It had been closed for years, and what remained was a company doing its best to serve its customers faithfully while the ground beneath it disappeared. Joey Basmaji had built something real and good and worth having. He had maintained it through difficulties that would have broken a less committed founder long before 2010. He had tried, genuinely and with everything available to him, to find a way through. In May of 2014, he ran out of ways. On May 6, 2014, Joey Basmaji issued a press statement. It did not read like a corporate communication. It did not contain the careful, distancing language of lawyers and public relations professionals managing liability. It read like a letter from a man who had spent 37 years building something he loved and was now watching it end, and who wanted the people who had made it possible to know that he understood what they had given. Although we did not achieve the desired result, I am proud of the passion and dedication that the Jacob team showcased over these past few years while trying to bring the company back to financial health. I would like to sincerely thank each employee and business partner that contributed to our success during these 35 wonderful years. Those words were read by 4,000 people across Canada who had just learned that the company they worked for was filing for bankruptcy protection under the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act and beginning the process of liquidating its remaining inventory. They were read by women who had managed Jacob stores for 15 years, by stock associates who had been there since their early 20s and were now in their late 30s, by district managers who had overseen regions of the country and built teams and maintained standards through 2 restructurings and years of uncertainty. For all of them, May 6, 2014 was the day they knew it was over. Not the day they suspected it, not the day they feared it, the day they knew. The liquidation process began immediately at all 92 remaining locations. Jacob stores, Jacob outlet stores, and Jacob liquidation stores across the country. The signs went up in the windows within days. Closing sale. Final clearance. Everything must go. The language of retail liquidation is always the same, always carries the same flat, exhausted energy. The vocabulary of a business that has stopped trying to attract customers and is now simply trying to convert its remaining inventory into cash before the doors close permanently. What happened inside those stores during the liquidation weeks was something more complicated than a sale. The women who came in were not simply bargain hunters. Many of them were customers of 15 and 20 years standing. Women who had a specific and personal relationship with this brand and who came not primarily to find a deal, but to say goodbye. They moved through the racks with a deliberateness that was different from ordinary shopping, pulling things out, looking at them carefully, putting some back and keeping others, making choices that felt less like purchasing decisions and more like acts of preservation. This is the last Jacob blazer I will ever own. This is the last Jacob dress. Let me choose well. The staff who worked through the liquidation period described those weeks with a specific kind of emotional exhaustion. They were still showing up, still folding merchandise, still helping customers find things, still doing the job they had always done, but doing it in a store that was visibly dying around them, with racks growing emptier every day and no new shipments arriving to replace what sold. The back rooms, which in a functioning retail operation are always full of incoming stock, were quiet. The process of a store closing, from the inside, is the process of watching a space become gradually less itself until one day it is simply an empty room with fixtures. Many of those employees did not know, from one week to the next, exactly when their specific location would close. The liquidation proceeded store by store, region by region, the timeline determined by how quickly inventory sold down in each location. A manager in Halifax might know that her store had 3 more weeks. A manager in Winnipeg might not know if she had 2 weeks or 4. The uncertainty was its own particular cruelty, the inability to prepare properly for an ending whose date kept shifting. The customers who made one final visit to their local Jacobs store in the autumn of 2014 encountered something that many of them found genuinely difficult to process. The physical space was the same. The fixtures were the same. The lighting? That specific Jacob lighting, warm and honest, that had been part of the experience since the first boutique in Sorel, was still on. But the racks were sparse in the way that only happens when a store is not being restocked, when what remains is what remains and nothing new is coming. The color stories that Jacob's buyers had always assembled carefully, the coordinated groupings that made it easy to build an outfit by standing in one section of the store, were fragmented, picked over, incomplete. It looked like Jacob. It smelled like Jacob. But something essential was already gone, already absent from the space in a way that was hard to name precisely, but impossible not to feel. Women who had shopped at Jacob for decades have described those final visits in remarkably consistent terms. There is the word empty, not just the racks, but the feeling of the place. There is the word wrong, the wrongness of a familiar space in the process of becoming unfamiliar. And there is almost universally the acknowledgement of something that surprised them, that they had not realized until the moment of losing it how much the store had meant to them. How much of their sense of themselves, their professional identity, their understanding of what it meant to dress well on a Canadian budget, their memory of specific purchases tied to specific moments in their lives, had been held quietly and without fanfare inside those walls. The social media response to Jacob's closure was unlike anything Canadian retail had produced before it. In 2014, Facebook and Twitter were fully established as platforms for public conversation, and the announcement of Jacob's final liquidation produced an outpouring that ran for days. Women posted photographs of their Jacob clothing, blazers still hanging in closets, dresses worn to events years earlier, the occasional shopping bag kept as a kind of artifact. They wrote about specific purchases with the precision of people describing important memories. The burgundy blazer bought in 1994 for a job interview, the black dress bought in 2001 for a colleague's retirement party, the first piece of adult professional clothing bought with a first real paycheck in 1989. They wrote about their mothers. They wrote about their daughters. They described, in language that was often more eloquent than they seemed to realize, exactly what Joey Basmaji had spent 37 years trying to provide. The experience of being understood by a place, of belonging somewhere, of having a reliable and trusted answer to the question of where a Canadian woman went when she needed something real to wear. The grief was real. It was not performed nostalgia or social media sentiment. It was the genuine response of people who had lost something that had been part of how they understood their own lives and who were only now, in the moment of losing it, fully reckoning with what it had meant to have it. In late 2015, a small revival attempt began. Joey's family reopened 5 Jacob locations, all in Quebec, 3 in Montreal, 1 in Old Quebec City, and 1 in Sorel itself. The original location where Jacob Basmaji, the father, had opened his shop and where his son had begun building his dream in 1977. The Sorel store reopening carried a weight that no press release could adequately describe. The building that had started everything, the street that had given the company its first customers, the community that had watched Joey Basmaji grow from a young man with an idea into the founder of a national institution. It was all still there, and for a brief period the lights were back on and the racks were filled, and it was possible to believe that something had been retrieved from the wreckage. Those 5 stores operated through 2016 and into 2017. The customers who came were faithful and glad, but 5 stores in one province, run by a family that had just survived a decade of financial crisis, operating in a retail environment that had continued to harden against mid-market fashion while they were gone. It was not a foundation. It was a farewell extended by determination and love into something that looked for a short while like a second chance. By early 2018, all 5 locations had closed again. The Sorel store, the original, the beginning, the place where everything had started, locked its doors for the last time sometime in the early months of that year. The closing was not announced with a press release. It did not generate the national conversation that the 2014 liquidation had produced. It happened quietly, the way most final endings happen, with more dignity than drama and more sadness than anyone who was not there would ever fully know. What remained of Jacob after 2018 was a website selling fragrances, 3 cents produced in Quebec, bottled locally, sold online to the women who still remembered the brand and wanted, perhaps, to hold on to something of it. The perfumes carried Jacob's name. They were made by the family that had built the company. They were, in their modest and melancholy way, the final form of Joey's original promise, that she deserved something of quality, made with care, that understood who she was. It was not nothing, but it was very far from 250 stores and 4,000 employees and 3 generations of Canadian women who had built their professional wardrobes, their family memories, and a piece of their national identity inside those warm and honest rooms. When the last store closed and the last employee turned out the last light, who came to mark the occasion? Who was there to say that something real had existed here, that it had mattered, that its passing was worth more than a liquidation notice posted in a mall window? The answer is the women who posted on Facebook in 2014. The answer is the daughter who still has her mother's Jacob blazer hanging in a closet somewhere in Ontario. The answer is every employee who learned her profession inside those stores and carries that knowledge forward into whatever came next. They were there. They are still there. And the fact that they remember is the only monument Jacob ever needed. When the last Jacob store closed in early 2018, the malls that had housed those locations did not pause. The lights in the corridors stayed on. The other stores kept their doors open. Within months, in most cases within weeks, the spaces that Jacob had occupied were taken by other tenants, or they were not taken at all, left empty behind temporary hoarding, blank storefronts in the middle of shopping corridors that had been built around the assumption of anchor tenants that were no longer anchoring anything. In several Canadian cities, the Jacob closure was not an isolated event, but part of a pattern that was already visible to anyone paying attention. Le Chateau, another Montreal-based women's fashion retailer with a similarly long history in Canadian malls, was struggling through its own version of the same crisis. Reitman's, the family-owned chain that had served working Canadian women since 1926, was contracting. Mex Canada had already gone. The mid-market women's fashion segment, the space that Jacob had helped define and had occupied with such distinction for 3 decades, was not simply losing one player. It was collapsing as a category, squeezed from below by fast fashion and from above by accessible luxury, with nothing in the middle that could survive at scale in the new retail environment. The companies that filled the spaces Jacob left behind were, almost without exception, the companies that had contributed to its decline. H&M took several former Jacob locations in Ontario malls. Zara expanded into others. The geometry of Canadian retail reorganized itself around the international fast fashion model that Joey Basmaji had declined to adopt. And the customers who had once belonged to Jacob distributed themselves across those alternatives. Not happily in many cases, but practically. Because practical is what you become when the place you preferred no longer exists. The 4,000 people who had worked at Jacob when the first bankruptcy filing came in 2010 did not all survive the decade intact. Some had left before the crisis deepened, moved into other retail positions, taken management roles at competing chains, built careers that carried forward the skills and knowledge they had developed inside Jacob stores. For those people, Jacob was a chapter rather than the whole story, and it ended at a manageable point in their professional lives. For others, the timing was harder. A woman who had spent 20 years building her career at Jacob, who had started on the floor in her early 20s and worked her way into regional management by her 40s, found herself in 2014 re-entering a job market that had changed significantly since she had last navigated it. The retail management skills she had developed were real and transferable, but the industry she was re-entering was contracting rather than expanding. The chains most likely to hire her were the same chains that had contributed to Jacob's collapse, companies with different cultures, different operating philosophies, different relationships to the kind of customer-centered retail that Jacob had practiced. Many of those women found their way. Some did not find their way back to anything comparable to what they had built at Jacob. The severance available to employees of a company in bankruptcy proceedings is not generous, and the emotional cost of losing a career identity that had been built over 2 decades in a single company is not something that a severance payment addresses in any meaningful way. The pension situation, while not as catastrophic as the defined benefit pension losses suffered by employees of some larger retail collapses in North America, was nevertheless a source of real hardship for employees who had counted on retirement security that the company's financial collapse compromised. These were not abstractions. They were real people who had made real decisions about their lives, where to live, whether to take other opportunities, how much to save independently, based on an assumption of institutional stability that turned out not to hold. The broader lesson that Jacob's collapse delivered to the Canadian retail industry was one that the industry was simultaneously receiving from a dozen other directions, and one that, even with all those signals arriving at once, not everyone absorbed quickly enough to act on. The lesson was this: the mid-market model, built on physical presence in shopping malls, selling merchandise on traditional seasonal cycles to customers who had no meaningful alternative, was not a permanent condition of retail life. It was a historical moment. It had lasted long enough, from roughly the 1960s through the early 2000s, to feel like a permanent feature of the landscape, like something that would simply always be there. It was not. It was a window, and the window had closed. Jacob had the misfortune of being large enough and successful enough that its failure was visible and consequential, but not large enough or differently structured enough to have survived the transition that would have been required. The retailers that survived the decade, that had navigated the shift from physical to digital, from seasonal to continuous, from product-led to experience-led, did so by making uncomfortable decisions early, by investing in infrastructure that did not produce immediate returns, by accepting short-term disruption in exchange for long-term viability. Jacob made those decisions too late, or not at all. The e-commerce infrastructure that Cloudraker had proposed in the mid-2000s, built at a moment when the cost of building it was manageable and the competitive advantage of having it would have been significant, was never built at meaningful scale. By the time the company understood that it needed to exist online in a real way, the cost of building that presence had increased, the competition for digital attention had intensified, and the financial resources available to fund the investment had been consumed by the crisis of physical operations. The revival attempt that produced 5 Quebec stores between 2015 and 2018 deserves more than a footnote. It was, in its own way, a demonstration of exactly the quality that had made Jacob worth saving in the first place. Joey Basmaji did not walk away. He did not sell the brand name to a private equity firm or license it to a manufacturer with no connection to its history. He and his family returned to Quebec, to the stores and communities where Jacob had begun, and tried to rebuild from the ground up with whatever remained. The customers who came to those 5 stores were real customers, genuinely glad to have the brand back in any form. The merchandise was real merchandise, made with the same care that Jacob had always applied. The experience, by all accounts, was recognizably the Jacob experience. Warm, attentive, honest. It was not enough. The economics of operating 5 physical stores in a single province, without the digital infrastructure to reach the national customer base that had always been Jacob's true market, did not work. The world had moved too far in the 4 years since the liquidation for a partial return to the pre-2014 model to be viable. Joey had tried everything he knew how to try. The 5 stores were the last thing he knew how to do, and he did it with the same integrity he had brought to everything else. What do we lose when a gathering place disappears and nothing takes its place? The question is not rhetorical in the way that questions sometimes are, asked for effect rather than for answer. It is a genuine question about what retail, at its best, provides to the communities it serves, and about what is actually absent when it is gone. Jacob was not simply a place to buy clothing. It was, for millions of Canadian women over 37 years, a place where they were known, where the staff understood what they needed, where the merchandise had been chosen by people who understood their lives, where the experience of shopping was not a transaction to be optimized for speed and price, but a genuine encounter with a version of themselves they were in the process of becoming. The first real blazer, the dress for the important dinner, the suit for the promotion. Those moments happened somewhere. For a generation of Canadian women, they happened at Jacob. The stores that replaced it, the H&Ms, the Zaras, the online platforms that now deliver clothing in brown boxes to front doors, are efficient. Some of them are even good. None of them are the same thing. None of them look at a woman who walks through the door and think, she deserves to be understood here. That is not a small loss. It is the kind of loss that does not show up in any economic measurement, but lives persistently and specifically in the memories of the people who experience the difference between being served and being known. Picture a Saturday afternoon in October 1996. A woman in her late 20s walks into a Jacob store in a mall somewhere in Canada. It does not matter which city, Hamilton, Saskatoon, Fredericton, it is the same store, the same light, the same feeling in every one of them. She is not shopping for anything specific. She has an hour between errands and she has walked in the way you walk into a place you trust, without agenda, without urgency, simply because being there is its own small pleasure. The store smells faintly of new fabric and something clean and indefinite that she will never be able to name precisely but will recognize, years later, as belonging specifically to this place and no other. The music is low, something unhurried, something that does not demand attention. The racks are organized by color, deep jewel tones for the autumn season, burgundy and forest green, and the particular shade of navy that Jacob always got exactly right. She moves through the store slowly, touching fabrics as she goes. The way you touch things in a place where touching is permitted and expected, and part of the point. She finds a jacket, charcoal gray, clean lines, the kind of cut that works for the office on a Tuesday and dinner on a Friday, without asking her to choose between the two versions of herself. She tries it on. The mirror is honest. The light is good. A staff member, unhurried, knowledgeable, present without hovering, says something accurate and brief about how it sits across the shoulders. She buys the jacket. She wears it for 11 years. That transaction, unremarkable in every particular, is the whole story of Jacob told in miniature. A woman, a store that understood her, a piece of clothing chosen carefully in a space designed for choosing carefully. An experience so consistently good, so reliably itself across 37 years in 250 locations, that it became part of how an entire generation of Canadian women understood what shopping was supposed to feel like. Jacob was never the most glamorous name in Canadian fashion. It never claimed to be. Joey Basmaji did not set out to build a luxury brand or a fashion institution in the editorial sense. He set out to build the store that the woman he had grown up watching, the woman his father had served in Sorel, actually needed. The woman who had a real job and a real budget and a real life that required real clothing, chosen by people who understood those requirements and took them seriously. That mission sounds simple. It was not simple. Maintaining it across 250 stores in 37 years, and every shift in the Canadian economy and every change in the fashion market required a constancy of purpose that is rarer in business than it sounds. The companies that lose their way do not usually do so because they forgot what they were trying to do. They lose their way because the pressure to grow, to diversify, to optimize, to compete on metrics that have nothing to do with the original mission eventually overwhelms the clarity that created them in the first place. Jacob held its clarity longer than most. The stores, even in the difficult years, remained recognizably themselves. The merchandise, even when the buying decisions were not always perfect, remained oriented toward the same customer, the same occasions, the same understanding of what she needed. The staff, even as the corporate machinery grew more demanding and the financial uncertainty more pronounced, maintained a quality of service that reflected the founding philosophy in ways that could not have been mandated from a head office, that came instead from people who had absorbed the culture and made it their own. What Jacob could not hold in the end was time, not its own time, the time it had spent building something real, but the larger time, the historical moment that was shifting underneath the entire model of physical retail. While Joey Basmaji stood in his stores and believed correctly about the past and incorrectly about the future, that she would always want to come in. She did want to come in. She still wanted to come in 2013, in 2014, in the final weeks of the liquidation, when she came in one last time and moved through the depleted racks with that specific gravity of someone taking leave of a place she had loved. What changed was not her desire. What changed was the world's ability to accommodate it on the terms that Jacob had always offered. That distinction matters. Jacob was not abandoned by its customers. It was overtaken by forces that its founder understood intellectually but could not bring himself at the decisive moment to fully confront. The love was real on both sides. The loss, because of that, was real on both sides. There is a Jacob blazer hanging in a closet in Ontario right now. There is one in British Columbia and one in Nova Scotia and one in a flat in Montreal where a woman in her 60s keeps it not because she still wears it, but because she cannot bring herself to give it away. It is the blazer she bought for her first management role in 1991. It is the blazer she was wearing the day she got the promotion she had been working toward for 4 years. It is, in the way that certain objects become, not simply a garment, but a record of a moment in a life. Proof that the moment happened, that the woman in it was real, that something was at stake and something was achieved. Jacob made that blazer. Jacob made 10,000 versions of it in 100 different stores for 100,000 different women and 100,000 different moments that mattered. That is not a small thing. That is, in the full reckoning of what a company can accomplish in the world, a very large thing. Larger than the revenue figures, larger than the location count, larger than the bankruptcy filing and the liquidation sale, and the quiet final closure of a store on a main street in Sorel, Quebec in the early months of 2018. Joey Basmaji named the company after his father. His father opened a shop to serve the women of his community. His son built that shop into something that served the women of an entire country for nearly 4 decades. The name passed from father to son to the women who carried it with them in shopping bags and closets and memories across every province in Canada. It still lives there, in the jacket that still fits, in the dress that still hangs, unworn but ungivable, in the specific quality of light in a fitting room on a Saturday afternoon that a woman who is now 60 years old can still see exactly, still feel exactly when she closes her eyes and goes back to the place she knew. The store is gone. The memory is not. And the memory for the women who lived it is not nostalgia. It is testimony. Testimony that something real and good and specifically Canadian existed here, that it understood them, that it served them faithfully for 37 years, and that its passing left a space in Canadian life that has not been filled and may never be. That is the story of Jacob, and it was worth every word of telling.